Hello, my name is Joseph Quigley, aka Pandemonium Heart, and yesterday was a truly monumentous day in DC Lorcana history. We saw the first ever competitive bans for the card game, with Hiram Flavorsham Toymaker and Fortispear both being on the chopping block. This leads to a lot of questions, but fortunately, Ravensburger has actually given us quite a few answers with a question and answer session. In this video, I'm going to highlight that session and some of the very interesting discussion that you may have missed from it, as well as give some of my own thoughts on this ban from a competitive perspective. First off, let's look at the announcement itself, in which Chief Marketing Officer at Ravensburger, Elaine Chasey, said that the reason for this ban was, quote, in order to keep the metagame healthy and challenging without it feeling stale or repetitive, seeing the same strategies again and again. The TCQ design team at Ravensburger made the difficult decision for the good of the game. From my perspective, this is quite fair. In Set 7, we have seen an absolute dominance of Sapphire, specifically both Ruby Sapphire and Steel Sapphire, with them making up more than 50% of top cuts across the game. It's clear that Sapphire, this set, is become far too powerful, and there is good reason that something needed to be done. And Hiram was a prime candidate. I have felt since Set 5 that this card was too powerful and centralizing in each metagame since. Red-Blue has remained on top, and Hiram has been a huge part of that, being very difficult to answer if you are not playing exactly red. Now, back in Set 2, when the card first came out, the card was a lot more reasonable. But as they've continued to print more and more powerful Sapphire cards, especially in Set 7, the card has just felt more and more unreasonable and oppressive. In my mind, a ban on him was completely fair. Fortispear is kind of a different but related conversation. It wasn't a card that I felt too strongly about. I'm fairly ambivalent towards this ban. You can see the reasoning for it, though, with Blue Steel having access to 8 one-drop cantrip items. It was a little bit much in combination with the new Bell card, where they could play it on turn 1 as a 3-3, sing powerful Steel songs for free, eliminate your early drops, and contest board extremely well. That whole line felt extremely strong and too consistent, and it makes sense that they wanted to keep Popsicle, the other one-drop cantrip, in blue as a card that could work with all these various item synergy cards. So I can understand not banning Popsicle. I could understand banning Fortispear, but I understand that others may question the decision a bit more, considering it wasn't really the core of the problem of Sapphire right now. But Ravensburger addressed that and much more in a question and answer session in Discord, and I'm going to highlight you some of the best responses and some of the questions that I had for this decision. So after the announcement, Ravensburger did an official question and answer session with Head of Game Design and Development Steve Warner to go over the decision. This was a fairly interesting move after making such a controversial ban, but it led to a really interesting discussion that gave some great insight into the minds of the game design team, as well as some rather fascinating off-color remarks from some of the audience. Let's look into it. Starting off with the question that I had for Steve Warner regarding Diablo, and this was kind of a recurring theme within this question and answer session. There's a lot of concern around 3-God Shift Diablo and the impact it has on the game. There were a lot of people calling for its ban back in Set 5, although that discussion cooled in Set 6. But there's some reasonable concern from myself and others about what this card could do in a metagame without Hiram. Green Steel seems like it could be very much back and also quite annoying, and it got some interesting buffs with Shift Pete. Green Purple discard was making quite a few waves with Diablo even before the Hiram ban, and could be even better positioned now. There is some reasonable concern that Diablo, which has been considered a bit of an oppressive card in the past, could be better than ever and become a centralizing force in the metagame. But Steve Warner had a rather decent response that there are still many answers to Diablo, and although it is powerful, they want powerful cards in the game, but they will watch it and address if needed. This is a fair enough response from my perspective for the time being. In set 6, they printed Genie, which with the dominance of purple decks was a reasonable enough check to Diablo that it really declined in popularity. And that is still a card that's around. I know Genie has become a lot less popular, but it could resurface a bit more now that the power level of blue has been changed drastically downward. I do still worry about Diablo, but compared to Hiram, it is a significantly easier to answer card with a lot of the Steel Songs and removal dealing with it, with cards like Brawl dealing with it, with green having a card like Kit that can deal with it, with purple having Genie and Elsa that can both kind of deal with it depending. Although it's not as nuanced as answers exist because Diablo is a really questionable card design of a card that essentially punishes you for trying to dig for answers to it if you don't already have them, which can make it iffy and make it run away with games. It is true enough that there are enough ways to build your deck to consider Diablo that it might be okay in the metagame ahead, whereas something like Hiram, if you weren't playing Ruby, kind of didn't have great answers. You could bounce it with Kit, but then it could still be played to draw 2 more cards, so it was a little bit rougher in that regard. It remains to be seen, but I'm okay with this answer for the time being. There were quite a few people in this discussion that were not happy with the ban, and quite a few people that were questioning Fortespear in particular. This commentator suggested that there should be a trial period, perhaps, where they reconsider Fortespear, questioning the idea of Fortespear being banned and saying it can be benign, saying that in the post that Ravensburger made, they were talking about cards being not fun and imbalanced, and yet Diablo Devoted Herald exists, and he points out some of the issues that he sees with Diablo, which I can at least understand that much. This was one of the first questions, and Steve did respond to it, saying that I appreciate the concern, but this is the way we feel is best for the game going forward currently. I think he was giving a bit more leeway to questions that perhaps were being a bit more polite, but he did address this one even though it was quite negative. We did see quite a few questions relating to discard, a mechanic that many people don't find fun, and even as somebody who has played a lot of discard, is something I can understand. I think it is fair to question this design mechanic in Lorcana, particularly when it's not targeted discard. Steve here says that they are being very cautious of discard as an archetype, but he seems to say that discard is a mechanic in card games that should exist within reason and to a limit where the game remains fun. I'm not so sure about this. Granted, I have enjoyed playing discard, and I think targeted discard can be reasonable. I think, for instance, that Ursula 2, that discards songs from hand, is kind of a necessary evil given the power level of some of the songs in the game. But I do recognize that when you discard your opponent's entire hand, even though it might be very fun for you, and I'll admit I have had fun doing that, it is not very fun for your opponent. It is not very fun to go up against. So it's an interesting bit of design insight. We did have a DKP come in to say, quote, I just hope that you guys realize that discard is never a fun and healthy game mechanic when it actually resolves around discarding the entire hand in any TC key. This is a position that a lot of people out there have, that a lot of games have, frankly, and I think is fair. It's clear that the Lorcana design team is not really at that point for the time being, but I think it'll be interesting to see how they decide to handle discard going forward, because we haven't really seen any discard support in the past few sets, notably. I'm a big fan of Yellow-Green Discard, which was arguably the best deck of set 4, and I can tell you we are still basically running the same set 4 deck list because that deck has gotten nothing in the way of discard support the past few sets. So they seem to be at least a little bit cognizant of we don't really want to make more discard. They did print Bend to My Will, which didn't work in any current discard decks. It did open up green-blue as a deck that could run that card and make you hate your life a little bit. So they're maybe still not entirely dismissing new discard cards based on that particular one. I think it's going to be an interesting point of conversation within the game going forward beyond today. One interesting point of the discussion was Steve talking about Steel's color identity. He answered this question and said that cards that draw a card in Steel made it too consistent. The decision was to remove some of that potential frustration. He went on to talk a bit more about color identity of Steel, saying that For the Spear's effect of drawing a card when it is played is an issue with the number of cards that they have that are drawing cards. Item synergy is not normally a Steel mechanic, quite the opposite really, and a number of cards in Steel drawing leads to too much consistency. It is noteworthy that Steel doesn't have a lot of cards that only draw a card. They have a lot of cards that draw and then make you discard, essentially giving you filter. There was that new Mulan card, for instance, gets printed this set, one drop that lets you do that as a 2-1, which has been pretty decent depending on the deck you're talking about. There are cards in Steel that let you draw cards if you have no hand, as a notable downside. And of course, Whole New World, even though it is very powerful, has that downside of refilling your opponent's hand, although you generally mitigate that downside pretty well. Whereas For the Spear is a card that just draws you a card. No downside, no nothing, just play and draw. And that seems to be what Steve is getting at, the idea that Steel isn't really supposed to have just flat-out card draw with no other kinds of restrictions. Your mileage may vary on how much you buy the explanation regarding For the Spear and the consistency it can offer, especially considering For the Spear has basically not been played in any other Steel color pairing except for exactly blue Steel. I think it's maybe been talked about in red Steel, but I don't think that's been particularly noteworthy. I thought Steadfast mentioned a red Steel usage there. But broadly speaking, I can kind of understand that Steel isn't supposed to just have flat-out card draw, but whether or not you think that makes For the Spear ban-worthy is perhaps another matter. There were a couple of questions relating to the decision-making process around this ban, as well as the decision not to just do an errata like they did with Bucky several months ago. Steve disclosed that their preference is towards banning, but they will evaluate each case going forward, which is some interesting insight because we were kind of wondering after the first precedent of Bucky being an errata whether or not they would keep doing that going forward. It's interesting that they're kind of changing their minds on this in a sense, but I feel like it might have to do with just where the game was back with Bucky and how much it's developed since then, and perhaps they've given it some more thought and consideration. Perhaps in Bucky's case, they were a bit worried about outright banning it, particularly given the game was about to launch in Japan, and Bucky was going to be an early card in set 2 there, and they were perhaps concerned with the confusion it could cause if it was banned in the West, but then was printed as is in the East as a broken card, or at least about to be a broken card once set 3 and set 4 come into being in the world of Japan. Now, things have changed. They notably said that the ban would not apply to Japan for Hiram, and so I think they might be in a more stable position now, where they feel more comfortable with their market in the East, or at least they feel like they know what they're doing more, and so they're willing to do bans, which ultimately is more sensible in a lot of ways because Bucky's errata was effectively a ban in the sense that the card became unplayable, and perhaps the trying to nerf cards and then print promos of the nerf version was perhaps something that they didn't want to have to keep doing. So I can understand that particular logic. Now, Steve also confirmed that there are no plans to do any unbanning in core constructed going forward. We do see it happen in other TCGs where over time, as more power creep comes into the game, cards might move off the ban list because they're more reasonable now. So this is a fairly strong statement to say that there's going to be no plans for that in the future, although that tends to take a lot of time anyway. But it really makes sense when you consider the rather fascinating comment we got later on in the discussion, where somebody asks if rotations are a possibility, and Steve says it is a Bruno question. We just simply won't be able to talk about future OP plans right now. Bruno, of course, referring to we don't talk about Bruno. This, if you're reading between the lines, would strongly suggest that rotation is something that is probably going to happen. It's not 100% confirmation, but I think this strongly seems to indicate that we are going to see some form of rotation coming down the pipeline. Steve also addresses the idea of not just limiting cards, i.e., perhaps instead of banning a Hiram, they could have said you can run 2 copies of Hiram in your deck. Instead of banning Force Spear, maybe you can run 2 copies of that card. But he explains that he feels that restricting powerful cards tends to make it more about did you get that card in the game, meaning that, hey, I found the Hiram or I didn't. I found the Hiram, that means I win. I didn't, that means you feel like you kind of got sacked, essentially. It doesn't feel good. I really agree with this line of thinking. I don't think there is a point in trying to limit a card that you feel is toxic enough or damaging enough to the metagame that you think it should be hit. Just get rid of the problem at that point. There's no reason to kind of play around and say, we'll let you sack with this broken card once in a while. We'll just reduce the consistency. Unless your banning philosophy involves like a lot of different consistency hits, it's kind of iffy to do that. There are certain circumstances you can make it work, but generally I prefer guest banning. You could have made an argument to perhaps like limit for the spear, because essentially the issue is the critical mass of one drop item cantrips. So you could say like if Word Spear was a 1 of, then Blue Steel only has 5 of the cantrip instead of 8. Maybe that's enough, but it leads to some perhaps mixed signals, so I can understand why they went this route. Some people will question why go for Hiram when we've had some pretty busted blue cards printed recently. The 6-drop legendary Tamatoa is obviously really strong. The new Bell that can come in on turn 1 is obviously really strong. And here he discloses that these are cards they considered. And he said, although those cards are good, they did not provide the long-term advantage that Hiram does. We did test out how things will play out. He also addresses some other cards that get mentioned by this questioner. He says that as far as Rabbit being balanced in order to continue to draw cards, it requires a bit more investment by the player, either in ink or opportunity. I think that's quite fair. Rabbit has been declining in popularity even among purple decks. It does have the downside of being a bit on the slow side and not applying a lot of pressure to the board at this point. Once upon a time, Rabbit was the most broken thing in existence, quite possibly, but it's definitely declined a bit as the power level of the game has slowly increased. It feels reasonable now. Like it's still a very good card. It just doesn't feel that oppressive to me because there are plenty of answers to a 2/3 on turn 4 if you want to get rid of it. It obviously does draw you cards, but that is part of Amethyst's color identity. It is uninkable, at least. It's not unreasonable at this point. He does have a very interesting line on Prince John, where he says that Prince John has always had ways to counter him. We believe that players will be able to find ways to interact with Prince John and that deck. That is technically true in that there are cards that answer Prince John. The issue is most of them tend to suck. This is one of the only lines in this whole conversation I did not like, and I did not think passed the sniff test. And I did see quite a few people comment on this particular line of thought as well throughout the discussion. The issue is Prince John has Ward. There are cards that can get around that, obviously with B-Prep or Grab Your Swords. Also, Grab Your Swords is very low in popularity right now. But these cards are more expensive, are uninkable, can be clunky, can be countered by the fact that John also gets to run Ursula too, to get rid of those cards from your hand before John comes down potentially. And there is an inherent design issue with having a card with Ward that does not have to exert to get a lot of value. We saw this obviously with Bucky, but we do see it with John as well, where he can just sit on the board turn after turn, and unless you have very specific niche answers, he's going to get a lot of value, and then he'll only turn when it is absolutely completely safe for him to do so. This is not good because it's very hard to interact with and doesn't feel really fair. Ward, I think, is a perfectly fine keyword in cases where the card has to exert to get value. And you're basically saying, like, this is a card, it's almost guaranteed to get the value when it exerts, and you can't stop it from doing so. But then once it exerts, you can interact with it, you can challenge it, and then you can deal with it at that point if I don't counter your challenge somehow. That's more interactive gameplay. But a card that with Ward that just sits on board unexerted forever is not very healthy. There are certain cards that are non-targeting that can get around it, but most of those cards tend to be pretty easy to counter because as long as Prince John has a buddy, those non-targeting cards aren't going to do anything to stop him. So I don't think this really passes the smell test. That being said, I do think the other parts of this particular post are fine. Rabbit isn't too good, and Tamato and Bell, although both being very good cards, are perhaps more easy to deal with than Hiram has proved to be. We did get a mention of Worlds. I wanted to highlight that because I know people are very desperate for Worlds news, myself included. Steve said we felt that this would not be a healthy deck to have at Worlds. We want the meta to be fun right now in response to a question about why do this before Worlds comes along. This doesn't really say much about when Worlds might be. It might imply, if you squint, you could say maybe this means Worlds is happening this set. But given that the new set comes out at the end of May, start of June, that seems very unlikely to happen on such short notice. But hopefully it indicates that Worlds is coming soon, fingers crossed. This was a rather interesting comment from somebody else saying that Hiram was not the problem. It was printing all 4 of these in one set for one color, while the other colors got jank legendaries like blue. There clearly needs to be better playtesting with cards before the set releases to avoid this. He points to, of course, Tamatoa, Bell, Scrooge, and Sapphire Coil, all extremely powerful cards, to varying degrees, I should say. But it felt like really unreasonable, this set, having blue get so much while other colors kind of felt like they didn't get nearly as much, honestly. And that is indeed how I think this metagame got warped so much to Sapphire. And I think it is a fair criticism from a set design perspective for them to push blue so much harder than other colors, seemingly. I mean, I can say that, like, even before people were playing these cards en masse, they saw Tamatoa, they're like, that's a crazy card. They saw Coil, they're like, that's a crazy card. They saw Bell, and people were very, very sad unless they enjoyed playing blue. It was, like, a lot, and it was clearly a lot from the outset as people could evaluate. Now, Steve kind of addresses part of this in a later answer where he says that within the first hour of releasing the set, even before that when all the cards are revealed, the huge number of people in the community has put in more hours than it is even possible for us to do in testing. We have a great development team that tries to kick everything and make sure that we have fun and exciting cards. However, sometimes we miss things. This is kind of a problem that all TCGs can face to one degree or another, where they have playtesting, obviously, but the player base is always going to be so much more massive, have so many more minds, that they will be able to find things that can be missed. I do feel that in this set, it was so egregious that I don't know how much this holds water. Something like Bucky. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'll just say, regardless, I think they really probably should have been able to figure out they were pushing Sapphire too hard in this set, especially given Red Blue had become a very strong deck for several sets. But I think it is worth noting that they cannot have the same amount of testing as the entire rest of the player base essentially can collectively. As the session winded down, we did see quite a few people express appreciation to Ravensburger for doing this question and answer session. Here we have Snobby, the famed former judge, say that he was glad to see this communication, and I, for one, certainly agree. It was an interesting format, but I was really happy to see Ravensburger engage and answer questions for the community and address a lot of the concerns people have and explain more of their reasoning. I think that's really important to see in banlist talks, and although we may disagree with the reasoning, you perhaps leave yourself open to that disagreement or to one comment being pointed at and laughed at. I think it's still worthwhile to do. That communication is important and will always, almost always, do more good than harm as long as your reasoning is solid, honest, and good faith. So I was really happy to see this discussion. I think most of the answers were quite good and appropriate. There were a couple of flubbed lines, like I did not like the reason of Prince John, for instance. But by and large, it was a really good, productive discussion with some great answers. If you want to see the full question and answer session, I will post a link to the Discord and the Q&A down below. I'm not sure if they're going to be posting it anywhere else, but I will include a link if they do post the answers elsewhere in case you want to look at those. I definitely think it is worthwhile to do, and there's a lot of great insight in this. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Shout out to my team, Enter the Battlefield, and a special thanks to Endgame Sleeves as well. Hope to see you for the next one.